So when it comes to camping, I believe there are basically two types of people in the world that have gone camping. The first wants to tell you all sorts of stories about all the fun things they did and is secretly planning their next camping adventure in the back of their mind, pretty much at all times. The other group of people also wants to share a story with you about their camping experience, but it probably involves how they were cold, wet, miserable, maybe all three of those, and how on their first and only camping trip they ever took, it was just horrible, and they frankly can't understand why anyone would ever want to spend a night in the wilderness. As somebody that's spent a lot of nights out in the wilderness and enjoys any moment that he can get outdoors, in particular with his spouse and or family, I want to share with you some tips that can help put you in that first group. And if you're somebody that's never gone camping before, hopefully this will help set you up for success. If you're somebody that maybe has a little bit or a whole bunch of camping experience under your belt, I'll put some tips at the end on how you can help those newbies and make sure that you make that first experience awesome. Because I truly believe that your first night in the woods kind of sets the tone for the rest of your wilderness experience. Much like anything, if you go out and it's horrible, if you're cold, if you have a terrible time, if you don't sleep, and just everything about it is frankly kind of crappy, it's not likely to be an activity you're going to do again. So let's get into the tips. The first one is probably the easiest, but one that often goes ignored, and that's stacking the deck in your favor. And what I mean by that is, as you get into camping, basically the more money you spend on gear, the more it does one or some combination of four things for you. Number one, it's lighter. Number two, it's going to keep you drier. Number three, it's warmer. Or number four, it's more comfortable. Now, instead of going out and blowing a whole bunch of money on gear, potentially for an activity that you don't really like, what I mean by stacking the deck in your favor is for your first outing, pick some weekend where it's going to be temperate, it's going to be dry, there's hopefully no or very little rain in the forecast. You're ideally somewhere close to home, so if everything goes horribly south, you can jump in the car and jet yourself back. Even if you have dreams of, summiting Everest or doing some elaborate mountaineering expedition or, backpacking the PCT or the AT or whatever, start with stacking the deck in your favor. Don't go out on this multi-day expedition, go somewhere local, go somewhere close, and you're probably thinking, hey, how can I predict the weather? Obviously you can't, but what you can do is pick a couple or three weekends in a row, far enough out in advance, book those 3 weekends at a local campsite, and as you get close, if it looks like it's going to rain, call up and cancel your booking so somebody else can use it and so it frees up the site, and then try again the next weekend. Pack yourself up for that first weekend. You can essentially have everything ready to go except for your food. And then if a couple or 3 days out, it looks like the weather's going to be bad, just cancel and try again next weekend. This way, instead of going out and getting all the best gear and using that to ensure that you are staying warm and dry, potentially doing an activity you don't like long-term, you're stacking the deck in your favor by giving yourself multiple weekend options and making sure you're going out for a night where it's hopefully going to be sunny, it's going to be dry, and it's not going to be super cold or excessively warm in the evening. Some of the more experienced folks may poo-poo that and say, hey, a true camper is going to go out when it's cold, they're going to go out when it's wet. And absolutely, with a combination of experience and gear, you can camp in pretty much any condition, and people do tons of extreme stuff in the outdoors. But if it's your first time, or if you're going with a first timer, stack that deck in your favor so they want to come back and do it again. And at that point, you can start to think about, hey, I like this so much, I'm more than happy to do it in a thunderstorm. What do I need to make that happen? Now, along those lines, the second tip, your two biggest enemies when you're outside are being cold and being wet. And they feed off of each other. If you're wet, your body's not going to be able to maintain its warmth and you're going to get colder. And once you start to get cold, you're going to be less apt to set up a shelter or build a fire or do whatever it takes to warm you up. And you create this vicious cycle. Now, that could be deadly if you're up in the mountains. If you're out on a family car camping trip, it's going to basically make everyone miserable. And the only place it's going to likely be deadly is being deadly to your camping aspirations. So a few tips on that front. Even if you've set yourself up for success, even if you've looked at every weather forecast out there, there's still a chance that you might get some rain along the way. So when you go out to your campsite, set up your tent in an appropriate spot. You don't just want to go and throw your tent on the first piece of ground that looks like it's clear. You don't necessarily want to throw your tent on the flattest piece of ground. You want to make sure you look for somewhere that's not going to get flooded in the event that it does rain. So walk around your campsite a little bit. Look for areas where there's obvious signs of water runoff. Usually you'll see kind of twigs and pine needles and leaves and stuff pushed to the side if you're in an area where a bunch of water comes through when it rains. If there's a depression, a nice little bowl in the ground, that may look like a comfortable and flat and great spot to sleep in terms of, nice flat ground, but it's a place where water is going to collect. And even the best tent, if it's sitting in, what's ultimately going to become a very tiny lake, is not going to keep the water out for very long. The better tents will do a better job keeping out the wet. They'll do a better job of staying upright in the wind. But if you set yourself up for success, you don't necessarily need to go out with a $200 tent on your first night. And you probably might be okay with that $20 or $30 Walmart special, even if it's not going to last you in the long term. Also, make sure you bring a rain jacket for both yourself and your tent. Again, even if there's no rain in the forecast. Rain jacket for yourself should be obvious. You hopefully have one kicking around the house that you can use. As you grow more advanced, you can get something lighter and maybe a little more outdoor appropriate. And what I mean by bringing a rain jacket for your tent is most tents either come with or have an option to purchase what's called a rain fly. It's a funny name, but it's essentially a rain jacket for your tent. It's an extra piece of nylon or whatever the tent is made out of. It's generally treated to be waterproof, and it goes on top of your tent and keeps the rain out should the rain come. And again, even if there's no rain in the forecast, I've been out dozens of nights where right before I go to bed, check my phone, forecast is absolutely clear, look up in the sky, there's stars everywhere, beautiful night. And then lo and behold, 2 a.m, for whatever reason, I'll wake up and it's starting to rain. I'd recommend putting on that rain fly, even if it's that perfectly clear night. That way, if you do wake up and it's starting to rain, you just zip a couple of zippers versus having to get out of your tent, goof around with trying to figure out how to put that thing on in the pitch black with nothing more than your flashlight and the rain starting to pour down on you. The only time people will tend to avoid that advice is if it's super hot outside. And again, hopefully you set yourself up for success by picking a weekend where it's not going to be excessively warm. But in that case, people sometimes leave the rain fly off because it does allow the air to circulate a little more freely in your tent. But most tents will have a way where you can put the fly kind of half on and maybe either unzip it or roll half of it up or do something so you get that air and ventilation. But if a rain does come, instead of having to start from zero and unpack the thing and get it all set up, you can kind of go and clip a couple things on, maybe zip down a few zippers. And it gives you a little bit of a middle ground. So you have the fly kind of ready to deploy, but it's not all the way on and preventing some of that air circulation that might be desirable if it is a little warmer outside. And speaking of air circulation, even on the coldest night, you do want to leave your tent open a little bit. This may seem a little counterintuitive, but it's as easy as maybe just unzipping the top couple or 3 inches of your tent door. And what that does is it lets some of the humidity that your body is naturally going to produce out of the tent. The reason you want to do that when it's cold is that moisture will come out of your body. It's in the air. You don't see it. As soon as it hits the nylon of the tent, which is going to be a bit cold, that water is going to condense. And if you ever go out and sleep in a tent that's 100% closed up, you'll wake up in the morning and you might even have a few drops falling on your head if it's a small tent and there's several people in there and you're kind of wondering what happened. It's from that moisture that comes out of your body. So do make sure you have that little bit of ventilation and you'll likely have a decent sleep. You'll be ready in case it rains and you'll keep yourself dry. And on the topic of sleep, again, this is I think, critically important aspect of a successful first outing. And when you talk to people that don't enjoy camping or had a bad experience, they'll almost universally mention that they had a terrible night's sleep. And that terrible night's sleep usually comes down to being cold. And this is something that's maybe not quite intuitive about camping, but probably the best way to stay warm and comfortable when you're sleeping is through some sort of ground pad. And I think, if you've never spent a night out in the outdoors and your only experience is watching movies or, when I grew up, it was seeing these cowboy movies where, the cowboys would be out, they'd set up a little fire and they'd, throw a blanket on the ground and that was that. And it seemed like, real outdoors people just sort of slept on the ground and that was kind of how you rolled. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But in our modern times, it makes a lot more sense to have a ground pad of some sort. And that's for 2 reasons. The obvious one is it's a little more comfortable to sleep on something than to sleep on the hard ground. The ground pad is almost like a cheat code for adding extra warmth when you're sleeping. And that's because the ground is always going to be colder than your body. Your body's 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground, even in the desert at night, is going to be less than 98 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're sleeping directly on the ground, you're essentially sleeping on this thing that has unlimited capacity to suck heat out of your body. And even if you have the world's greatest sleeping bag, your body weight's going to be crushing that sleeping bag down. The part where your body contacts the ground isn't going to insulate very well. And the ground's just going to sit there and suck all your heat out of you throughout the night. So not only are you sleeping on something hard that's probably not perfectly flat or even, but you're sleeping on something that's sucking your body heat away and making you get cold at the coldest time of the day. So the way you avoid that is through a ground pad. On all the gear I mentioned, I'll put some recommendations for kind of a starter set down below in the comments. I will add the tip slash disclaimer slash whatever that, if you can borrow stuff from friends, if you're part of scouts, they might have loaner gear you can use. Some of the outdoor stores will rent stuff. Go and get something used on Craigslist or whatever for your first couple times. There's no need to buy new gear. But some people also look at it as, it costs me $100 to $300 to spend a night in a hotel. I'm going out in the woods for a couple nights, spending $200 to $600 on gear doesn't seem like a bad investment. So that's what the intent of some of those recommendations is. But your ground pad doesn't have to be anything super elaborate. I think a lot of people, when they go car camping, they envision some gigantic, air mattress, which might be very comfortable. It's also not the greatest insulator because it's essentially full of air, which will get cold during the night. So even something as simple as a piece of foam, you'll see light blue. I don't know why they always seem to be light blue, but if you go to any camping store, you'll see like a light blue foam ground pad that you can roll out. That's about, 2.5 feet wide by 6-ish feet. You just roll that sucker up, unroll it, put your sleeping bag on top of it, and you're good to go. There's more advanced foam pads. There's a thing called the Ridge Rest that has some little grooves in it that makes it a little more comfortable and a little bit warmer. There's self-inflating pads. Thermarest is kind of the well-known brand in that space, and I'll put a link to those guys down below. And then there's things like the Xped pad that costs as much as a cheap mattress. That's essentially foam and air and all sorts of stuff. So you can really get elaborate, but I think you'd be way better off just starting with that simple blue piece of foam than you would be sleeping on the hard ground. The other tips I'll give you on sleeping are essentially no cost. And one of them, if you've ever heard the old adage that if you're outside and your feet are cold, put on a hat, that applies to sleeping. And I'll almost always pack some sort of winter hat, even in the middle of the summer, particularly if I'm out in New England or the Northwest or somewhere where it could get cold at night. If you wake up and you're a little bit chilly, you throw on a nice winter wool hat. It's still fairly comfortable, and that tends to warm up your whole body. Unless I'm down in the dirty South in the midst of August, I'll have at least a lightweight skull cap that I can throw on. You can also make yourself a sleeping bag liner. You can buy these. They come in all sorts of fancy materials that range from super cheap to almost as much as a low-end sleeping bag. Or you can do something as simple as sewing an old sheet together. So you kind of flip it over and sew it like a burrito so the top is open. You can pull that sucker on. It's going to add a couple degrees of warmth to you. It's also going to keep your funk from getting on the sleeping bag. So it lets you wash your sleeping bag a little less often and keeps it a little bit more odor free. And it's also nice if you're in the summer and it's super hot, you can kind of just sleep in that little sleeping bag liner, open up your actual sleeping bag or kind of use it as a blanket, and that way have a bit more temperature range available to you. Now, the last tip for the new folks, quite simply, make things awesome. You're not going out into the woods to do your own version of Hunger Games or, your own episode of Survivor Man or whatnot. Try and find ways to make the trip really fun. If you've got kids, let them bring a stuffed animal, bring some board games. If you're somebody that likes to cook, you've got this whole new challenge of you're outside, you're away from your oven and maybe some of your elaborate kitchen gear, and maybe you've got a single or a double burner propane stove. What kind of cool things can you make? Or, what kind of really amazing cuisine can you come up with that you cook over the campfire or in a Dutch oven or, some sort of crazy thing like that. And you've also got the benefit of time when you're on the outdoors. Instead of waking up and having to rush to work, maybe you wake up and you create a 2-hour ridiculously elaborate breakfast and you have cowboy coffee and some sort of egg dish and pancakes and whatever. And if you're not someone who loves to cook, rock out with some hot dogs on a stick over the campfire and then bust out some s'mores after. I've made super elaborate meals and I think my kids enjoy the dogs on a stick and the s'mores way more than the most fancy thing that I've ever created over a set of hot coals. Take the time to channel your inner child, sit around the fire and tell some ghost story where you forgot half the plot and kind of make it up. Kids love that sort of thing. Sit around and sing a campfire song or play a game of cards or something and put away the phones and just enjoy that time that you have together with this person that you're enjoying this experience with. If you're out with a bunch of adults and it's, possible and or legal, and the legal realm of this seems to have been ruined by somebody somewhere in most of the state and national parks, tuck a flask in, bring a little bottle of wine or something, drink it responsibly. Don't go out and be hooting and hollering and keeping people awake and causing problems, but sitting there with somebody whose company you enjoy around the campfire, talking junk and sipping on a little bit of bourbon, nothing wrong with that. And that's a nice way to make that experience memorable and also, I guess, keep you a little warmer at night. The final element of making things awesome, at the end of the day, if you can, as you leave, make the place a little bit better than you found it. I've got kids, so part of the end of our camping trips is always what I call policing up the area. That's what the scouts called it when I was a little kid. But make them patrol around, find some junk, then I'll inspect and make sure they picked up some trash, and just building that behavior of being a good guest and steward of the outdoors, I think, is a way to make that experience awesome and to engage everyone in that collective camping experience. And now the final tip is for those of you like me who maybe had a bunch of experience and then married somebody who never had gone camping before. Maybe you're someone that's ready to take your kids out in the woods or whatnot, or you want to bring some friends or a girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever out. Probably the most important tip I can give you is one that's purely mental. If you go out and say, hey, I'm going out to have fun, I'm bringing someone along who's also going to have fun, I'm going to kind of plan things the way I normally would and maybe ramp them back 5% because this person's never done it. If you do that, you're going to be frustrated. You're probably going to frustrate the person you're with. You might end up having a terrible time and being mad at everyone by the time you're done. So instead of going out with that mindset, the mindset I would go with, particularly on your first trip with somebody that's never been camping, is don't go out thinking, hey, I'm doing an activity that I enjoy and I'm looking forward to having fun. Go out with the mindset of, hey, I'm going to teach this person and create an exceptional experience for them. And maybe somewhere back in your deep, dark list of priorities is maybe they'll enjoy this and want to do more of it with me. And then I can kind of shift to, hey, I'm having fun with somebody versus I'm kind of being the guide and more of the helper and creator of an experience versus a participant. I think if you do that, that's going to force you to do things like say, hey, normally I would go for a 60-mile, 3-day weekend backpacking trip. Instead, I'm going to go for a 2-night car camping trip that's close to home. You start to think instead of, hey, it usually takes me 30 minutes to set up camp. I'll have a bunch of helpers, so it'll take me 20 minutes. You start to think, hey, it usually takes me 30 minutes, but I'm going to need to help get everyone set up. I'm going to need to help make everyone feel like they're comfortable and like they're participating somehow. So it's going to take me 90 minutes to set up instead of that 30. And if you kind of assume, hey, I'm going to have to do most of the jobs, I'm going to have people this whole weekend coming up and saying, hey, how do I do this? How do I open the tent? Why is my sleeping bag shaped like this? What's this stupid thing on the top of my sleeping bag for? Which way do I hold the knife? When do we eat? I'm hungry. It's cold. If you're prepared for all that and you're thinking, hey, I'm here to guide these folks, you'll have an amazing time and you'll be able to see how they enjoy the outdoors. You'll be able to see them learn. You'll be able to see them have a great experience camping. And at the end, you'll say, that was awesome. And I created something for somebody else and did this beautiful act of love and giving for that person versus at the end of the weekend saying, holy shit, that was awful. I was out there to have a great time and I just ended up helping everyone and getting mad. Set your mind up properly if you're the person that's kind of the guide, and think of yourself as that guide and that creator of an experience for that first camping trip, that somebody has done a great act of respect for you by agreeing to come out and enjoy something that you do with you. So return that act of faith by being a faithful servant to them for that first trip, and hopefully you'll plant some seeds that will one day grow. And in my case, after a couple of 3 initial camping trips, my wife is probably, I'd put her up there with the best of them. We hit camp, she knows what to do. She sets up certain aspects of the camp. I set up others. The kids are starting to help out a little bit more. So, putting in that time in the beginning can create a lifelong camping relationship. So with that, I hope these tips help, and I hope that your first camping experience is absolutely awesome. Even if you go out and you're warm, you're comfortable, you eat well, you have a few laughs around the campfire, and at the end, you say, this really isn't for me. This is not something I'm going to do again. I would consider my mission accomplished. Maybe there's an off chance that you go out, you're warm, you're dry, you have a great time, and you say, hey, I'd like to explore more of this. There's this whole universe of camping in front of you. You can go in directions from getting a land yacht RV and going and driving around in national parks and doing that sort of thing, and sitting outside and watching satellite television, which I don't quite get, but if that's your thing, you do you, boo. Or you may go down a path of, climbing up K2 and doing winter mountaineering and being one of those crazy people that's clipped into the side of a rock face and sleeping in a little hammocky thing that just seeing pictures of gives me vertigo and almost makes me poop myself. So whichever direction you go, I hope you do get to experience the outdoors. I hope in some small way these tips help you enjoy and have a successful first trip. And if you have any camping questions, put them in the comments. If there's enough, I'll do another video. More than happy to answer your questions, because I do want to see more people enjoy the outdoors, particularly people that are able to take friends, family, loved ones, and kind of have that collective experience. I think we're missing some of that bonding over a campfire that maybe our forefathers and foremothers, if that's a word, once had. So until that time, wish you the best in all your outdoor adventures. And this is the Big Heavy wishing you well and saying peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.